Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, traveled to Finland but rejected formal invitations from both the Finnish president and prime minister, insisting he was in the country for a different, specific mission. Ibrahim Traoré stated on social media that his visit aimed to oppose neo-colonialism and support African unity, reinforcing his pan-Africanist ideology. His primary mission was to visit Africans detained in Finnish prisons, particularly Simon Ekpa, who is imprisoned in the Kilmakoski Correctional Center in the city of Lahti. Simon Ekpa is identified as the Prime Minister of the United States of Biafra, USB, and his detention since November 21, 2024 has now lasted over 130 days. Ibrahim Traoré realized he couldn't act alone and contacted Namibia's president, Dr. Nambao Nandi, who shares his vision and has now pledged support for the Biafran cause. Representatives of the United States of Biafra government met with Ibrahim Traoré in Lahti and formally briefed him on Simon Ekpa's legal situation and the status of the Biafra movement. Through Ibrahim Traoré's influence, the USB leadership formally requested Namibia to recognize the United States of Biafra as an independent sovereign nation, delivering a diplomatic letter to President Nandi. Ibrahim Traoré met personally with Simon Ekpa and his lawyer, Kael Gemers, to discuss legal strategies and efforts to secure Simon Ekpa's release on bail, although the details are being kept confidential. Ibrahim Traoré's actions sparked wider reactions as Yoruba Nation activists in Nigeria publicly declared support for Ibrahim Traoré and the Biafra movement, calling for reforms and African self-determination. In a surprising development, the US government under President Donald Trump has allegedly recognized the United States of Biafra Army and its forces, signaling international attention and possible geopolitical shifts. In the early months of 2025, the world witnessed an unexpected and politically charged event that united the flames of African resistance, diplomacy, and the long, complex struggle against neo-colonialism. The president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, known for his bold pan-Africanist vision and defiant posture against Western influence in Africa, made a sudden and surprising visit to Finland. This visit, however, was not for state business, as might typically be expected when one head of state travels to another country. It was not to negotiate trade, not to attend a global summit, and certainly not to strengthen bilateral ties with the Finnish government. Instead, Ibrahim Traoré's visit to the northern European nation was entirely driven by a deep ideological commitment and a specific mission: to meet with Simon Ekpa, the man who is widely recognized by his followers as the Prime Minister of the United States of Biafra, who at that time was being held in the Kilmakoski Correctional Center in the Finnish city of Lahti. Ibrahim Traoré made it abundantly clear from the beginning that his purpose was not to entertain diplomatic pleasantries with Finland's leadership, but to shine a light on what he considered an unjust imprisonment of a fellow African revolutionary. When Ibrahim Traoré arrived in Finland, he received official invitations from the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, and from the Prime Minister, Petteri Orpo. Both sought to welcome him for discussions at the presidential palace in Helsinki. These invitations followed traditional diplomatic protocol. But to the surprise of the Finnish government, Ibrahim Traoré rejected both overtures. He was direct and unambiguous. He did not travel thousands of kilometers to exchange ceremonial handshakes or attend dinners. He had one mission and one mission only: to confront the issue of African oppression outside of the continent and to demand justice for Simon Ekpa, whose continued detention had now lasted over 130 days since his arrest on November 21, 2024. Simon Ekpa's case had by then drawn global attention among African diasporas, liberation movements, and political observers alike. He was not just any detainee, He was the symbolic leader of a controversial and highly charged political movement that sought the independence of Biafra from Nigeria, a region that had already suffered from a bloody civil war in the late 1960s over the same issue. His supporters claim that Simon Ekpa represents the voice of millions of Biafrans who feel politically marginalized, economically strangled, and socially silenced within Nigeria. Simon Ekpa's detention in Finland was no minor issue to his followers. They believed it was orchestrated under international pressure, especially from the Nigerian government, which had long labeled his activism as incitement, even though Simon Ekpa had remained outside Nigerian territory. His legal team argued that his arrest was politically motivated, and many within the Biafran diaspora pointed to what they called a coordinated effort to crush the growing legitimacy of the United States of Biafra movement. Ibrahim Traoré's arrival in Finland therefore took on a deep political and symbolic meaning. Here was an African head of state who had built his reputation as a fearless opponent of Western interference, making a personal stand for another African leader being held thousands of miles away from home. Ibrahim Traoré had previously spoken out against the forces of neo-colonialism, foreign military bases, exploitative trade deals, and puppet regimes. His visit to Finland became an extension of that resistance, making it clear that African sovereignty must also be defended outside of African soil. Upon reaching Finland, President Ibrahim Traoré did not stay in the capital Helsinki for long. He quickly made his way to Lahti, where Simon Ekpa was being held in the Kilmakoski Correctional Center. The facility itself has a reputation for being one of Finland's toughest prisons. In fact, it had once been the subject of a Netflix documentary which described it as harsh and deeply isolating. For someone like Simon Ekpa, who is a political figure rather than a conventional criminal, his continued detention there drew accusations of inhumane treatment. President Ibrahim Traoré visited the prison, not just to meet Simon Ekpa personally, but also to assess the conditions under which he was being held. However, Ibrahim Traoré quickly realized that standing up to the Finnish legal and political system was not something he could do alone. In a decisive move, he contacted another African leader, Dr. Nambao Nandi, who had recently become the president of Namibia. She had been sworn into office on March 21, 2025, and was already gaining a reputation for bold leadership and progressive pan-Africanist policies. Dr. Nambao Nandi responded positively to Ibrahim Traoré's call. She shared his vision and concern. Together, they began forming what might be seen as the early foundations of a pan-African alliance, not just rooted in speeches and theory, but in real-world action, diplomacy, and defiance. The two leaders agreed to explore formal diplomatic support for the United States of Biafra, a move that could have far-reaching consequences for the political balance in Africa. During Ibrahim Traoré's stay in Lahti, he met with representatives of the United States of Biafra government. These included high-level officials acting in place of Simon Ekpa, such as the Deputy Prime Minister, identified in the transcript as Ungo or Arab. They updated Ibrahim Traoré on the legal challenges facing Simon Ekpa, the status of the movement for Biafran independence, and the growing support they had within the African diaspora and other liberation movements. Through the encouragement and guidance of Ibrahim Traoré, the United States of Biafra leadership formally sent a diplomatic letter to President Nambao Nandi of Namibia. The letter was a formal request asking her government to recognize the United States of Biafra as an independent and sovereign nation. This was not just a symbolic move. If Namibia were to accept the request, it would become the first country to formally acknowledge Biafra's independence in modern times, an act that would likely spark serious diplomatic backlash from Nigeria and possibly from other Western-aligned African nations. President Nambao Nandi reportedly expressed full support for the movement. Her pledge of allegiance to the cause was seen by many as a historic milestone. It signaled that African unity, in this context, was no longer just about economic integration or regional security. It was about shared liberation from what leaders like Ibrahim Traoré and Nambao Nandi see as the shackles of both past and present colonialism. But perhaps the most emotionally charged moment of the visit was when Ibrahim Traoré finally met Simon Ekpa face-to-face. The meeting took place inside the prison under guarded conditions and accompanied by Simon Ekpa's Finnish lawyer, identified in the transcript as K.L. Gemertz. Though the details of their conversation were kept confidential, observers believe they discussed possible legal strategies for securing bail, broader geopolitical implications, and ways to protect the rights of African political figures detained abroad. What was made clear after the meeting was that Ibrahim Traoré left deeply moved and even more committed. He began making calls and diplomatic overtures behind the scenes, trying to arrange for Simon Ekpa's release, or at the very least, to secure fair treatment and a transparent legal process. He was reportedly outraged that Simon Ekpa had been kept in the prison for 132 days without a clear path to resolution. For Ibrahim Traoré, this was not just an attack on one man, it was an attack on African dignity and autonomy. Interestingly, the ripple effects of this meeting quickly reached Nigeria. Within days, the Yoruba nation movement, which has also long harbored ambitions of independence from Nigeria, publicly announced its support for both Ibrahim Traoré and the Biafran cause. This was highly significant. The Yoruba nation had remained quiet for months, perhaps biding its time or watching for signs of change. But the alignment of Ibrahim Traoré and Dr. Nambao Nandi with the United States of Biafra breathed new life into dormant secessionist energies in Nigeria. A publication from Vanguard newspaper confirmed the development, stating that the Yoruba nation now recognized Ibrahim Traoré as a key figure in Africa's ongoing struggle for true independence and self-determination. The public endorsement meant that what began as a diplomatic mission had grown into a broader continental moment. The struggle for African sovereignty had crossed borders, regions, and ideologies. Even more astonishing was what appeared to be a dramatic move by the United States government under President Donald Trump. According to the report, the United States had allegedly recognized the United States of Biafra Army and its military forces. If true, this would represent a seismic shift in international politics and would immediately invite scrutiny, backlash, or support from other major powers. For now, the full implications remain unclear, and official confirmation remains pending. But the very mention of recognition by such a global power underscores the seriousness of the situation. At the heart of all of this is a question much larger than one visit, one leader, or one prisoner. The question is whether Africa can truly free itself from external domination, not just through slogans and summits, but through united, unapologetic action. Ibrahim Traoré's trip to Finland is being viewed by many as a turning point. Not only did it challenge the status quo, but it also laid the groundwork for a new type of African diplomacy. Bold, direct, and deeply grounded in the reality of people still struggling to be heard. As news of President Ibrahim Traoré's unexpected journey to Finland spread, it sparked widespread reactions across the African continent and among the African diaspora worldwide. For many, this event marked the first time in recent memory that an African head of state traveled to Europe not for economic aid, trade negotiations, or international conferences, but to defend a political prisoner, an African activist no less, on European soil. The symbolism was powerful. A sitting African president, known for rejecting Western dictates, now standing firm in a European capital, refusing to engage in protocol diplomacy while insisting on justice for a fellow African. This was, to many observers, not only rare, it was revolutionary. The Finnish government, known for its quiet, efficient and rule-based diplomatic approach, found itself in a situation it had never experienced before. Ibrahim Traoré's rejection of the Finnish president and prime minister's invitations broke from all traditional diplomatic customs. Finnish officials initially attempted to downplay the tension, but behind closed doors, there was growing concern over what was clearly becoming a global story. Media houses in Finland began covering the visit extensively. European Union officials started to take interest, especially as President Ibrahim Traoré's visit began attracting African protesters and supporters of Simon Ekpa from across Europe. Simultaneously, Simon Ekpa's legal situation became a point of fierce debate. His Finnish lawyer, K.L. Gemerts, filed several appeals questioning the legality of his prolonged detention. One of the major arguments raised by his legal team was that Simon Ekpa had not committed any crime under Finnish law. All his broadcasts, political writings and declarations were made from Finland, under the protection of freedom of expression and political association. Yet, Finnish authorities, under heavy pressure from international law enforcement networks, had detained him based on what was widely believed to be an Interpol Red Notice request issued at the behest of the Nigerian government. The Red Notice, often used for fugitives or suspects wanted internationally, is not equivalent to an international arrest warrant, but it does pressure local authorities to detain the named individual. In Simon Ekpa's case, it was deeply controversial. His supporters argued that he was neither a criminal nor a terrorist, but a political dissident, advocating for the self-determination of a people who had long endured marginalization and violence. They pointed to the Nigerian military operations in southeastern Nigeria, where entire villages had reportedly been burned, with hundreds of civilians killed under counterinsurgency campaigns aimed at rooting out Biafran agitators. Simon Ekpa's defense team insisted that this was a political case, not a criminal one, and as such, Finland had a moral and legal duty not to collaborate with the Nigerian government in suppressing peaceful political dissent. They submitted expert testimonies, human rights reports, and public records indicating that returning Simon Ekpa to Nigeria would likely result in torture, indefinite detention, or even assassination. These legal arguments began to sway public opinion in Finland and beyond. Meanwhile, back in Africa, something extraordinary was unfolding. President Ibrahim Traoré's actions had triggered a wave of new diplomatic discussions among African nations that had long kept their distance from secessionist movements like Biafra's. Traditionally, African countries have been reluctant to support any breakaway movements because most of their own borders are colonial creations, drawn arbitrarily without regard to ethnic or historical realities. Supporting Biafra, in the eyes of many African leaders, would set a dangerous precedent that could reignite their own internal separatist calls. But Ibrahim Traoré, and now President Nambao Nandi of Namibia, were openly challenging that old logic. Their argument was different. They declared that post-colonial borders must no longer be used to justify the continued suffering of ethnic groups, particularly when such suffering was being perpetuated by post-colonial states acting with impunity. In their view, the legitimacy of a state must come not from its old colonial boundaries, but from its ability to serve, protect, and empower all of its people. Where a state fails repeatedly and systemically, they argued, the people have the right to withdraw their consent and seek self-determination. This argument resonated across a younger generation of Africans, especially those in West and Central Africa. Youth leaders in Ghana, Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and even Kenya began organizing online campaigns in support of the Biafran cause. Hashtags such as #FreeSimon Ekpa, #African Sovereignty, and #JusticeForBiafra began trending on X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The African Union, for its part, was uncomfortably silent, caught between a historic policy of non-interference and the moral urgency of what was becoming a continent-wide awakening. More surprising still was the reaction from certain corners of the Caribbean and Latin America. Politicians and civil society organizations in Haiti, Jamaica, and Venezuela issued public statements expressing solidarity with the Biafran struggle. Some drew parallels between the Biafran resistance and their own histories of slavery, colonialism, and resistance. For them, Simon Ekpa was not simply a Nigerian rebel. He was part of a larger historical narrative about black liberation worldwide. Back in Finland, the tension inside the Kilmakoski Correctional Center was escalating. Simon Ekpa's health was reportedly deteriorating. His legal team filed a request for immediate bail on humanitarian grounds. Supporters outside the prison held daily vigils. President Ibrahim Traoré, still present in Lahti, held a series of behind-the-scenes meetings with European human rights lawyers and a delegation from Amnesty International. He also reached out to members of the European Parliament, arguing that the continued detention of Simon Ekpa violated international human rights standards. It was at this point that the narrative took another sharp and unexpected turn. An unofficial leak from a diplomatic cable between Finnish officials and the Nigerian embassy in Stockholm revealed that Finland was under increasing pressure not only from Nigeria but from certain European Union states who were concerned about rising African resistance movements. The cable suggested that Simon Ekpa's imprisonment was being quietly framed as a test case to see whether European countries could continue to arrest African political activists without facing significant backlash. The leak ignited outrage. Finnish human rights activists began speaking out more vocally. A protest in Helsinki attracted over 10,000 people: Africans, Europeans, students, activists, and members of the general public, who now saw the case as a human rights issue, not a legal technicality. Chants calling for Simon Ekpa's release, alongside banners praising Ibrahim Traoré and Nambao Nandi, dominated the streets. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, the government was growing increasingly alarmed. For months, it had believed that it had contained the Biafran movement by pushing Finland to detain Simon Ekpa. But that containment strategy was now collapsing. Simon Ekpa had become more powerful in detention than he had been while free. His image was now appearing on walls and posters, not just in southeastern Nigeria, but in Accra, in Lusaka, in Windhoek, and even in Johannesburg. Icon on the top right corner of your screen to watch my next video. You will enjoy it. I will see you again in my next update. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye for now.